Over my career, I've done a lot of interviews with some well-known people and some people no one's heard about before. I thought it might be fun to drag some of them out of the archives and share them here on YouTube. And the next time you listen to a radio station, not a rock station, but one of the older, better listening stations, don't just assume that the disc jockey on duty is pulling out records, CDs now, and playing them. Maybe there's a program director somewhere who dictates the ebb and flow of the music. A man who's won more awards than you can count for doing just that is CHUCK SOUTHCOTT. I talked to Chuck about his early years, his love of music, and was surprised when he told me that as a child he didn't want to get into music. He wanted to do something else.
I think I love cowboys. I wound up with a horse in Pacific Palisades when I was a kid. And I would, for those of you who know Southern California, I would ride that horse over the fire breaks from Pacific Palisades to Tarzana in the San Fernando Valley and back. And
now, we should point out, if I'm right, a fire break is kind of looks like a road. It's a cleared area, and they go up and down the ridges and everything in order to keep the fire from jumping. And we have so many brush fires out there. So there was kind of a path that wasn't intended to be a path.
That's right. And years later, I went to work for Gene Autry at his radio station in Los Angeles, KMPC, and I was at a party at which he was there, and there was a lady there who was Monty Montana's daughter. Montana's a guy who'd been in all the parades.
Sure.
And, good lasso artist and all of that. And I mentioned that story I just mentioned to you, and she said, my daddy used to do that. She thought that her dad did a very strange thing. But when she found out a 13-year-old kid was doing the same thing, she said, my dad was pretty hip,
Absolutely.
That's right.
So you're kind of a cowboy as a kid, growing up in the hills near Los Angeles. But you run into Monty Montana's daughter. He was well connected in radio cowboy shows and kind of a minor hero out here.
Yeah, he was something. He went to all the grammar schools, and he'd show the rope tricks and that sort of thing. And I remember when my kids were going to school, they said, guess who we saw today, Dad? I said, what? That guy who came to your grammar school in the Palisades, Monty Montana.
Oh, boy.
He was still doing it.
I guess whether you like to make quilts or sculpt or throw darts or whatever, if you get that in your system, you do it till you die.
Yeah.
And I think the sad thing is that there are so many older stars, even cameramen, writers out here in Los Angeles who have faded into obscurity, who have wonderful stories to tell. And let's talk for a second about Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters.
Sure.
Because here is a group founded originally by Jim Jordan, who was Fibber McGee, and Edgar Bergen, if I'm not mistaken. And there are still hundreds. Every time they get together every couple of months, it's a massive meeting, and they hold it here.
And Ralph Edwards was part of the initial organization?
Yeah. Tell us about that and how that's preserving, giving the older people in broadcasting, movies, television a chance to get together.
It was put together in 1966 originally, and you correctly identified the people. Art Gilmore was another, one of the great announcers. In fact, he was, I believe, the first president. The award given out, we have 5 meetings a year where we honor celebrities of some sort, people who have given something to the industry, radio or television, through the years. And we give them the Art Gilmore Memorial Award.
Back to the trail here, if I may use that word. Here you are, a young guy, and you're into cowboys. You like riding horses. At that time, L.A.
Say young guy again.
Young guy. And at that time, L.A. was younger, and there was more open space than there is now. You can't find any. Did you realize early on, though, that you had this wonderful, wonderful voice that you should do something with?
I never had a wonderful voice.
I think
never even had a good voice.
It's ultra-adequate. How's that?
What I have now, I worked at getting. It was really a job. And it didn't come naturally. It came a little unnaturally, which is kind of an embarrassing thing to admit.
So you weren't like Gary Owens, who probably sounded like that since puberty.
I can do Gary.
Oh, good.
But Gary, one time when I told him that they wanted me to do a commercial doing an impression of him, he said, "Don't do that. I'm suing a guy right now for doing that."
Well, then I guess the question is, how did you move from being a casual cowboy to getting into broadcasting?
Now, this is a weird answer. The Caribbean. My stepfather, who was a makeup man in Hollywood, always French, too, and he loved Jacques Cousteau. He thought he was Jacques Cousteau. So we bought a boat, a cabin cruiser, in Long Beach, California, put it on a freighter, went through the Panama Canal to St. Thomas, the U.S. Virgin Islands, where I wound up skin diving and spearfishing every day. One of the days, I was with a guy who was on the local radio station. He said, "You ever thought of going into radio?" I said, "No." He said, "Do you want to?" He said, "It pays 50 cents an hour."
Oh, wow, that's big money.
Sure. So I took the job.
So you went from being a quasi-cowboy in a rural suburban part of Los Angeles to packing up everything you have, going to the Virgin Islands. You're spending idyllic days out in the beautiful water, and then somebody says, "Go into radio."
That's right.
Wow.
And I keep in touch with him to this day. He lives in Florida, sends emails. He listens to a program I have on the air, and he'll listen to it on the internet and call and say, "You know, you're sounding good." And I'm thinking, coming from you from that long ago.
Wow.
Well, he, as they say, broke me into it, and I never stopped.
This would have been about what year?
That was 1956. If you wanted to run a commercial, it was recorded. You did it on reel-to-reel tape. In fact, we had little tape recorders that ran at 3 3/4 IPS, and sometimes they'd get off speed. NBC and Mutual were two networks that we carried on tape. It was recorded in Florida, then sent by aircraft. Sometimes we had a newscast on that was a week old.
Oh, wow.
And a little bit off the speed. Commentary like Fulton Lewis Jr. to NBC's Monitor.
So everybody down there thought that everybody in NBC sounded like this.
That's right.
That's right.
Or like this.
I remember I worked at a radio station in D.C., and we were using Associated Press radio, and they had a guy named Jack Vale, and our circuit wasn't very good.
And it was Jack Vale, New York.
Well, they got us a full quality broadcast circuit, and the first time I heard it was Jack Vale. You know, dust came out of the speaker. And I thought, wow, how much you can miss with a bad circuit or a bad tape recorder, not knowing what stuff really sounds like. Yeah. So how long were you down there?
Down there 3 years. Almost all of the 3 years I had the good fortune of living on boats, which was nice, our own boat. And then there was a guy out of Puerto Rico who had a 32-foot ketch, and he wanted me to live aboard and saw to it, just to see to it that people didn't come aboard and foul things up. So I lived on that one alone when I was 16 for about a year, and that was a hoot.
Are you aware of what an idyllic childhood you had?
More than aware. Yeah. I miss it to this day.
I mean, the hills of Los Angeles and then the blue-green waters of the Caribbean.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was a time.
Let's move forward. Something had to happen to get you into broadcasting back on the mainland.
Oh, yeah. I had the bug. That's all it was. And you understand that one.
Yep.
And I had to continue with it. My dad said, "I'm putting you through USC." I said, "Oh, what a great idea. Bye." So instead, I took a job in Bakersfield for $80 a week, playing songs. And that lasted about a month until they made it a country station.
You know, that is a real object lesson in how people who love radio will go just about anywhere to work. Bakersfield is kind of the lost urban area in the United States now. What was it like back then? Just all oil wells?
Well, as a friend of mine who used to write for the Los Angeles Times, a guy named Don Page, once wrote, he did a piece on me, a very kind piece, and he said Bakersfield looks as though it had been thrown out of a fast-moving truck.
I love it.
Okay.
See, I used to live up in the Central Valley. When my career started deteriorating, I spent 5 years in Merced.
Same thing.
And I would take, whenever I would go to L.A. or go over to Palm Springs, you have to go through Bakersfield. I would always tell friends that I went through Bakersfield. I don't think I've ever stopped there. So, but you say it changed format, as happens to a lot of us. We think we've got a good job, and all of a sudden, whammo, we're not there anymore.
Yeah. So I found another job after taking Greyhound buses to places like Merced and just trying to find anyone I could, and it was another Bakersfield job. And then was offered a top 40, hey, playing the hits job at the number one station in town. Took that.
Was there any more exciting format in the early days of rock and roll than getting to one of those top 40 stations? Because that was not quite, they didn't all scream, but they had the dun-dun-dun-dun-dun. I mean, everything was bright and upbeat, and you couldn't sleep. Or if you had a headache, you dreaded going to work, because it was tough work.
Well, you know, I was kind of raised on people like Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole, and that's what I wanted to play. I really did. And one night, we were changing a format, and I was allowed to stay if I wanted to at that station in the hotel. And I made fun of the rock and roll station, the top 40 station. I made fun of it, screaming, and, you know, next day I got a call. They offered me a job. I said, that was a joke. They said, no, we liked it. Come over here and do that act.
You thought you were doing a parody. You were actually doing an audition.
That's right.
Wow.
You're absolutely right. And I worked there for 2 years. We had 65.7 Hoopers, if anyone recalls that rating
That's the
service.
Pre-Nielsen
That's right.
service, yeah.
And that's in an 8-station market, so that wasn't bad.
Well, you had a big share of the pie.
Oh, it was amazing.
Yeah.
It was one of
Nobody does that now. I mean, there's 72 zillion radio stations.
Years later, I was talking to Robert W. Morgan, one of the great radio disc jockeys. He worked for me at a station, and we were speaking, and I was his boss, and he never liked the guys in the suits, but all of a sudden he liked me when he found out I worked for Kaffy, which was the station in Bakersfield, K-A-F-Y. And he said, wow. I said, wow. When I was there, you were in Fresno. That's a bigger market. He said, no, Kaffy was the show, man. You broke all the hits.
Wow.
So he was impressed that I had achieved that Bakersfield job.
That's interesting, because sometimes there will be a really dynamite station in a city that's not a major market. The talent just happens to come together.
Yeah, and a lot of records were broken there. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the promotion people would come to Bakersfield to get whatever it is they had, like a Shirelles release on Kaffy. And if indeed it worked, all of a sudden it was doing well in Los Angeles right after that.
So you were sort of a tryout city.
Yeah, test market, really. Yeah.
I remember, I don't know whether you've heard the name Jim Lounsbury.
Yeah.
Jim died a couple, 3 years ago, worked with him at UPI Radio, just a gentleman, but at one of the television stations in Chicago, he had an American Bandstand-style show 2 years before Dick Clark started his in Philly. And everybody who was anybody came through there, and he had a scrapbook. I mean, Elvis looks about 17 in the photo, but he said the same thing, that although Chicago was not a tryout market, you had all of these record producers, some of which back then had money in hand, in the payola scandals, but there must have been a huge number of song pushers working in the record industry back then.
I never got a dime, and I used to even say on the air, I'll take it. Nobody ever offered. And then I wound up playing Tony Bennett songs, and they never paid you for that anyway.
No.
You had to be playing the rock and roll hits.
One of my many regrets about radio is that I started, by the time we had magnetic tape recorders, and pretty good ones, that we in radio, and this is hard for people to understand now, you have to think in terms of the old 33 vinyls. We got everything every week from every record company.
Yeah.
We had walls of records, and instead of entrusting them to tape, I just played the Billy heck out of them until they got what we call Q-burned and scratched. The wealth of music that I ruined on bad turntables, I just really kicked myself. So where did you go after Bakersfield?
I had a plan. The plan was really specific, market to market, Broadcasters would understand this. You move up in market size. I thought I'd go to San Diego, then go to San Francisco, then finally come to Los Angeles. I wasn't interested in New York or Chicago. That was the plan. Company I was with in Bakersfield had a station in San Diego. I was offered a job there. We drove down, saw the station. I didn't like the way it sounded. I didn't like where it was. It was really in El Cajon, which is inland.
Yeah, a far-flung suburb of San Diego.
Right. And I thought, I had just gotten married. Now, what am I going to do? My wife didn't like it. I didn't like it. She said, try for Los Angeles. I said, what are you, nuts? So I had sent this tape. I had heard there might be something coming at a station called KGIL, and I dropped the tape off. And then later I contacted, and he may have contacted me. The point is, we were on the phone together. Rick Buckley, who at that time was the program director at KGIL, he said, I want you to come out here. I heard the tape. It's good, but I want to make sure you sound like that.
Because you can always, that's something people, I guess, maybe resumes are like that. You can always doctor a tape. You can always sound good if you have 3 days to fix all the mistakes. But can you speak that way live? There's big difference.
I admit I used a 44 microphone. There was one at Caffey, kind of hidden in a desk drawer. So it gave me that bottom end that a 22-year-old kid didn't have. And that worked out. But I came to KGIL. He watched me record, said, okay, we got a deal. I said, we do? He said, you're hired, but you can't tell anybody. Job doesn't start for a month and a half, and the guy who's leaving us doesn't know yet he's leaving us. But if I hear from anyone else, you're coming here, you won't be coming here.
Wow.
So I said, uh-oh. So I had to keep my mouth shut.
What a horrible secret to have to keep. Particularly if you're thinking this poor guy's going to get canned and I can't say anything.
Can't say it about him. No. I can't tell the people I'm working with. And the people I was working with kept assuming I was going to this station or that. No one ever guessed 1260 in Los Angeles.
So what did it feel like to relocate into the biggest market on the West Coast, going there from Bakersfield and think, my God, I've arrived?
Yeah, it was a major thing. Of course, this is my hometown, so I felt comfortable personally. But professionally, it was a case of, do I really fit here? And I didn't. To be honest with you, I didn't fit that well yet. It took a while. But thank heavens that the program director was as kind as he was. He was also the owner's son. And he went on to become the owner of WOR.
In New York, yeah.
And
this guy was a credible person you're talking about, the fellow who owned WOR.
Extremely.
Yeah.
Extremely. And a wonderful boss to work for. There's a thing in broadcast called a trade arrangement, and that simply means advertising in trade for the product, whatever it is. Used to be airlines, airline tickets.
So you could give away as a promotion, and in return, because you mentioned the airline, they give you the tickets to give away.
Yeah, and it's done quite
and one
legally.
hand washes the other.
Yeah. And it's very common with restaurants in certain cities, so that the salespeople can take their clients to the restaurant and not cost the station money for it because they do commercials for the restaurant that pays for it. So there are a lot of those. But whenever Rick Buckley, who's the GM I'm talking about, whenever a trade deal was about to end, there usually was a time factor in it. And if he'd look at it and notice there was plenty left, he'd spread it to the station. I recall the whole staff flying to San Francisco to another Buckley property.
Wow.
Only because he had trade left. So he said, okay, it's a party. We just bought this station in San Francisco. We're all flying out.
Holy
cow. So secretaries and engineers, and we all went. And that's the way he treated us.
That's extremely generous that he would see, hey, I'm not going to let these airline tickets expire. Let's share the wealth.
That's right. That was his attitude. And he thought first of his own employees. That's something. I mean, it seems today, considering what radio's become, or broadcasting in general has become, that's astounding to look back at that.
Now, KGIL, and then where? Because if we look at your resume, over the years you were connected with a phenomenal number of quality radio stations.
You know, everyone's an expert at something. I had become an expert at what they call adult standards. That Sinatra, Perry Como,
Nancy
Barbra
Wilson,
Streisand, Nancy Wilson kind of music. And, of course, today you would incorporate names like Michael Bublé as well. It was a unique expertise, if I do say so. There aren't many who specialize in that particular area. And I'd made quite a science out of it in terms of programming the music. And my favorite work is programming music. I do on-air work to be able to program the music. That's the connection. That being the case, when an opening came to a Gannett station in Los Angeles, Gary Owens had already been hired, and he was kind enough to say to the general manager, "You need Southcott. He's the guy you need to have here as your program director." And I didn't want the job. I was in syndication at the time, didn't need it, I didn't think, and I did take it, and that was a wonderful 3 years. There are a couple of other stops that I won't even mention, but a great one was working for the Cowboy. And
Gene Autry.
Autry was at this restaurant where we sit every day, just 30 feet away from where we are now, having breakfast with Pat Buttram, his sidekick for so long, you know.
Mr. Artery?
That's it.
You know, I did one of my shows this year as a half and half. The first half was at the Autry Museum, which is a splendid building in Griffith Park in Los Angeles, although it bears Gene Autry's name. The part of the museum that pays tribute to him is very small. I mean, every other cowboy star. There's even a huge display on Roy Rogers, which you wouldn't think in a Gene Autry museum. And then I can't remember the lady's name, but she was Gene Autry's secretary forever, and they are now cataloging every gun he ever owned, every bullet he ever fired. They're digitally remastering all the old shows and the recordings, and they're keeping that legacy alive. And I've always thought that if a consultant today were to look at Gene Autry and listen to his singing, they would say, this guy can't make it. But he became one of the biggest stars of the last century.
Well, it amazed
profited from it.
That he allowed me, and wasn't alone, others before me, to program the kind of music we played. Why not cowboy? Why not Western music? You would think Autry, being the expert he was and that sort of thing, but one of his best friends was Frank Sinatra. So there was a connection there. But the 3 years I spent working for him were 3 of my favorite years ever, because he had a hands-off policy. When you were hired, you did it. That was it.
Let's talk about programming. I remember working for a radio station for a while in Washington, D.C. during one of those periods when UPI didn't know it had any employees or not. And we programmed by texture. We would play everything from Kate Smith to Beth by Kiss. It didn't really matter the genre of the music. It was how did it sound. And I've always thought that you could get the best records of Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett and Ella Fitzgerald, all these people together, but if you didn't play them in the right sequence, it didn't work. How important is the flow of the music?
It's everything. It's everything. You and I might not agree on part of what you said in the beginning, but what you just said, we are in 100% agreement on. There's no question a combination of the era, the audience appeal of that particular, the gender, whether it's a male or a female, that sort of thing, the tempo of the song, all of these things go together. There are a couple of little secrets in programming it right that I'm not going to go into.
Okay.
I'll do that with the mics off.
Yeah, don't give them away.
But there are a couple of really basic secrets that are broken. They're rules that are broken all the time by programmers. And people would say to me, "Why? How do you get this time spent listening that is as high as it is, so long?"
Now, this is in the ratings. It's not the number, now they would say, of hits you get. It's how long they stay, whether they cross from one quarter hour to another. That must be vital in ratings.
Really is. You get a news station that perhaps changes the information every 15 minutes. Well, they're going to change the listenership as well. But on a music station, if what you're doing is flowing and continuing to hold interest, then keeping that person quite a while, that person gets counted every quarter hour as being essentially a listener. Could be new, might not be. But in the meantime, your average quarter hour maintenance, they used to like to say, would hold up simply by the fact that they don't go away. They're with you, on the average, sometimes 11 hours.
Good heavens.
In a week.
Yeah. I remember about the only rule they gave me at my second radio station, which was in a town of 20,000 in Indiana. Ought to do a movie about it because the man who owned it ran the local newspaper, which is not uncommon.
No.
And he didn't have a lot of money, and he didn't pay us very much, but he had a lot of employees. I mean, it was camaraderie to the max. There were a lot of really talented people there, weren't making any money, but we had fun doing it. The only rule they had was never play 2 male vocals or 2 female vocals back to back, except between 6 and 7 at night. We had an hour called Dinner Date where you could track an album. And today that pause between tracks, they would put dun-dun-dun-dun-dun something in there. And that was when I had supper. I would track that album. But do you go by the, unless it's Justin Bieber and Frank Sinatra, then it doesn't sound like 2 male vocals. Do you have that rule that you don't do 2 male or 2 female?
I have some rules, and not exactly that. Since there are so many performers, I do break the male rule especially, and once in a while the female, almost never that. But the instrumental every 15 minutes rule, the same sort of situation with a group vocal, that'll come up even less often. So I'm mainly concerned about standards placements along with different era placements. There was a fellow named Al Ham who developed a format called Music of Your Life, and he did very well with what he did. When I was in syndication originally, he was a competitor, and he knocked all our socks off by playing these old big band records and silly early 50s hits. I mean...
Well, my friend Jim Lounsbury, I mentioned, had a name for that era. It was when big band was really dying and rock was coming in, but they didn't know what it was. You had all these studio musicians, so you would have Andy Williams kind of doing a rock song, but it had 14 violins in the back, because Jim called that the "how much is that doggy in the window" era. Because you had funny hits like that would get to the top of the chart.
Somebody else came up with one I liked, the music that made rock and roll possible.
I heard a song coming in, Peggy Lee's "Is That All There Is?" And I remember at that station in Vincennes, Indiana, the music on the FM was on big reels of tape that played themselves. We called that automation. There were little tones that would tell the tape to stop and play the news when the news was over. Well, anyway, we signed off at midnight. A lot of stations did. And so we would play the sign-off. Now, during the sign-off, I had to walk in and tell the automation equipment that after "And the Home of the Braves," WAOV Vincennes, it would shut everything off. I forgot to push the button. So you hear the sign-off, and then you hear, "Is that all there is?" So every time I hear Peggy Lee, you look as if you have a story about that song.
Yeah, I do. When that was released, it came in, and I thought, I despise this record. It's suicidal. I can't stand it. But it's Peggy Lee.
Right.
I've got to play it. It's her latest. As it turns out, it was her last hit.
It's a morbid song.
Yeah.
It talks about when you die, there's nothing left, and should I take my own life?
But I knew it was a hit.
Yeah.
And I recall calling a couple of record stores to ask how it was selling. They'd say, "We don't know." "What do you mean?" "Capitol only gave us 3. I said, "What?" He said, "I know, everyone's asking for it, that's all." And then I got 3 more when I asked for more. It had to become a hit in New York. I knew it was a hit in Los Angeles, but they weren't supplying it to the record stores at all. So they did everything they could to keep her from having a hit. Of course, the Beatles were happening, and they had an interest in that, and it was the same label. But it turned into something pretty exciting for Peggy at pretty close to the end of her recording career.
I asked Chuck what it was like to do all of that award-winning programming in Los Angeles, where you not only had a big audience, you had access to the movers and shakers in the world of music, and sometimes direct access to the talent.
Oh, yeah. There was a 3-year period where I was doing mornings, again, a revised version of KGIL, and every day between 9 and 10, just about every day I had a guest. I'd never know who it was. Someone else was setting them up, but they knew, who we were playing. I have a favorite one, and maybe you can get a chance to incorporate it. It's on a little CD that I have. It's a short little piece. One day I was sitting in there, and I knew that Peter, Paul, and Mary were coming in. They were working the Hollywood Bowl. They'd be there. And son of a gun, if I didn't, all of a sudden, I was leaving on a jet plane. They had set up the instruments, and Mary was singing the song. I potted, as they say in radio, potted down the record, potted up
the studio
thing. That is one of the times that I got the goosebumps.
Leaving on a jet plane, but I just got here.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
That's the most unusual ending to that ever heard.
Chuck, let me get into a couple of other areas. You mentioned Gary Owens, and I don't know Gary well, but he was very supportive of UPI radio when we were having problems. And I remember interviewing him at Sinatra's funeral. Here is a man who not only is a very quick wit, is blessed with one of the greatest voices in the history of radio. Give me your memories of working with Gary Owens.
I've quite a few off and on. We've worked together. I'm trying to think of when we first worked together, but we worked together in the 90s. We worked together with 12 years on the Music of Your Life satellite network. And, of course, we were friendly enemies, if you will, as early as the 1960s. I guess we started working together in 83 at KPRZ when they were carrying the Music of Your Life network. I had turned down the job twice. Gary said, "What are you, nuts?" I said, "Well, I'm syndicating, and they don't want to carry my stuff." So my last meeting with the general manager at the station, he said, "Oh, come on in. Play your stuff. Add it to Al Ham's Music of Your Life. Do what you want." I said, "Oh, I'll take it." So I did take the job, and one of my syndication reels would go up while the earliest era of Al Ham's syndication reels went down. He was a little upset in the beginning, but yet we got together in 1995 and put that combination together on satellite. And the Music of Your Life network went 12 years. We were on 250 stations for quite a while.
Wow.
From 95 to
Well, Gary
2006.
Owens used to jokingly call it the music of somebody else's life.
And he wound up being
The
one
announcer,
of our
yeah.
guys on that.
What was
a lot of years.
What was it like to see your baby, your product here, suddenly coming out of radios all over North America?
It was exciting. And what was fun was you learned some things. One of the things I learned was that the huge egos of people in radio all existed in small markets. The smaller the market, the larger the ego. Now, at WWDC in Washington, D.C., which was carrying us 24/7, there was a marvelous program director, no ego at all. All he did was compliment everything he was just magnificent to work with. But get to, I'm going to say Punxsutawney, but I don't mean Punxsutawney. And all of a sudden you say, I need you all to promote my morning show, and I want Gary Owens to do 30,000 promos for me.
Well, you know, when I worked at that station in Vincennes, and I told this during another interview, I can't remember with whom I was talking, but there was a weatherman at WCBS television in New York whose name was Gordon Barnes. And Gordon was a meteorologist who actually helped develop theories about the Gulf Stream and now teaches flying in his later years. But he did a 5-minute midday show on CBS radio called The Midday Weather. And Gordon had kind of an odd speaking voice. And so he would always, if there was a front near Indianapolis, he would mention the CBS affiliate, listeners to W whatever it was in Indianapolis. Well, I called him up one night and left a message. And so I go home one night, and I hadn't heard anything from him, and my sister has this funny look on her face. I said, Diane, what happened? She said, well, I get a phone call, and this man identifies himself as Gordon Barnes. And my sister said, are you calling from the CBS Long Range Weather Center in New York? And he said, you know who I am? He was so impressed that I wanted him to do promos, and no one ever asked me. So what happened is he sent promos, and every time there was weather anywhere in Indiana, he would mention our city. And then a big package arrived. He had Cronkite do promos, and Lowell Thomas do promos,
great.
and Phil Rizzuto. So we were probably the smallest CBS affiliate in America that had all these marvelous. Douglas Edwards. I mean, everybody, his brother was on this reel of tape. But I fully understand that. You talk to people at small stations sometime, and you know, they think they're the center of the broadcast universe.
And in a sense, they are.
In that town, they would be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's no crime in that, I guess.
No, it develops kind of like Topsy on its own. I was just thinking of a guy who was a good friend of mine. We met on a commercial, and I've not been fortunate enough to do many of those real commercials. Obviously, when you work at a radio station, you do plenty. But
for which if you're not in a union shop, they'll run. I still have commercials, I think, running in Indiana that after 35 years that I was never paid for.
I can still do the 10-second station ID that I did when I was 15 years old in the West Indies. I do it by memory, because we did it every hour.
Chuck, you got a wonderful CD you've given me here. We played the clip from Peter, Paul, and Mary. But let's do another one. What would be a good clip from your career you'd like people to hear?
I like it all. I asked Johnny Mathis, and he's on here doing this, to name his favorite singers. He knew I had asked him that coming in. He said, what's he want to ask me? Johnny's a sweetheart of a human being. And I said, who are your favorites? So he wrote it all down, and he said, well, yes, well, my favorite. Well, I let him tell you.
Let's play the clip.
I thought Peggy Lee would be, I just had a lunch with her about 2 weeks ago. My first time really being able to sit down with her, and she's one of the most delightful people I've ever met in my life. She is very bright, very intelligent, and one of the greatest singers of all time. My favorite thing that she ever did, of course, was a recording called Lover, and I always felt that she was fire and ice. She's got all this fire underneath her, and she's the ice going over the top. Anyway, another collaboration that she did, and I'm sure she enjoyed it as much as we do. She did a picture called Pete Kelly's Blues with Ella Fitzgerald, where they both sang all the music, and Peggy sang one of my favorite songs, and it never sounded like this. It's so wonderful the way she sings Sugar.
Chuck, you have met an awful lot of wonderful people, and I totally agree with you. The niceness of a lot of people in broadcasting. I'm not sure many of the younger stars I would want to interview. But when I was working at UPI, and I would interview people such as Gary Owens, Ed McMahon, any of the Chuck Heston, shouldn't call him Chuck, Charlton Heston, I found them to be just the most common, wonderful people. And it wasn't even when they were on an interview. You'd go to a luncheon with them, and they seemed like your uncle. You know,
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people realize that generation of stars, movie and music, oh, sure, there were some clinkers out there. But for the most part, some of them were very nice. Tell us about some of the nice people you met.
The Ted Knight memory is kind of funny. We met on a commercial. We did the commercial together. It was his first year, I believe, the Mary Tyler Moore Show, his big break. Before that, he'd been doing cartoon voices. And before that, radio. And I complimented him. I said, I love the Ted Baxter character. It's hilarious, and the show's wonderful and all of that. And I said, if you have some time, I'd like you to be a guest disc jockey. I used to do that a lot with people. And it always worked out well. Almost always. And Ted said, sure, I'll be there. So he came to the station on a Sunday. I said, I'll score you the $35 after a minimum. And he came to the station. And who shows up but Ed Asner and Gavin MacLeod? And they're in the room with him. Mary Tyler Moore calls. And I'm thinking, boy, how did I luck into this? They were kind of a family.
Yeah, what camaraderie there must have been on the set of that TV show.
Amazing.
And when Ted Knight died, was it Adam West delivered the eulogy or Gary Owens? I can't remember.
I believe it was Adam. I was at that funeral. In fact, we went out to dinner to celebrate his Emmy. I took him to a restaurant I really liked. And as we were walking out to the car, we had trade. KGIL trade.
Run the commercial, get the free food.
That's right. And when we went out to the car, I said, well, how'd you like your steak? He said, yeah, it was as good as it was today when I was here for lunch. I had neglected to recall that where I was taking him was almost across the street from the CBS Studio Center, which is where they did the Moore Show.
Yes.
So he went into that restaurant quite a bit. It's no longer there, but it was an interesting evening.
You know, if this were 20 years ago, I would ask you the question, what would you say to a young person getting into radio? But there's so little radio anymore.
Would have answered it, I'm sure, the same way you would, which is go to the little town, work your way up. Now you can't even say that. With syndication and automation and group ownership that is behemoth, it's just huge.
Well, you and I remember the old rule was that no one person or company could own more than 7 AMs, 7 FMs, and 7 televisions. You tell that to kids today, and they look at you as if you're a dinosaur. I mean, some of these companies, Clear Channel, I don't know how many thousand broadcast properties they own now.
It's amazing.
But don't get me into that. What has the Internet done for music in your mind, the availability of it? Maybe I should combine that and say Internet and satellite distribution.
I don't think, and I'll lean on the Internet here, I don't think the Internet necessarily meant to kill the record industry. It did. But I blame the record industry. There was a fellow who was a longtime disc jockey in Southern California who wound up owning a record company. He also fronted 2 nightclubs. His name was Gene Norman. Wonderful voice, wonderful air talent. I was a big fan of his. And we became friends. Well, he formed GNP Crescendo. His major nightclub was called the Crescendo, where he brought in every big act there was, name it, Stan Kenton and Mort Sahl, and all of them. And Norman said to me, I said, well, how are you doing with the label now with the Internet supplying all this product? It's killed capital, it's killed... This is the best thing ever happened to me. I said, what's that? He said, oh, I got in the minute I knew what they were doing. I made it a point to sell my product through the Internet. They want to download the song. It doesn't cost them much, but I'm making a fortune out of it. But who didn't see that handwriting? Name the major label, whether it be RCA or Capitol, any of them.
Look at the people at Kodak who refused to admit that film was dying. when you thought camera, you thought Kodak at one time. And now what's left of it?
The death of the record industry, as far as the big labels are concerned, that was their own doing. It was suicide. They shouldn't have done it, but they did. And that's sad. So,
but Norman saw it coming.
Oh, boy, did he see it.
Yeah, and cashed in on it.
He said it was wonderful to me.
You know, it's difficult to stay ahead of the curve.
Oh, yeah.
And that is the thing you have to do. But you know, whether it's broadcasting or whatever it is, you hate to move too far because it does two things. It hurts your ego. It hurts your ego to think, well, you know, I've been doing it this way 45 years, and now they tell me it's wrong. If you look at my right hand, and people can't see it at home, I have a little Sony recorder that's recording us in CD quality. It weighs about 3 ounces.
I know.
And my first recorder in college weighed 32 pounds. And I remember we used to cut tape if there was a recording and we had to take a sentence out or whatever. You would mark it with a grease pencil and put it in a little thing that would hold it and cut it with a one-sided razor blade and put it together. And I still have scars. I think anyone who ever worked in a radio newsroom has scars on his fingers. When we went to digital recording, I fought it tooth and nail. But, Chuck, I wouldn't go back now if I had a million razor blades. You can teach an old dog new tricks sometimes.
Well, I produce and am the talent on a syndicated show called This Is Music. It's my title. I syndicated a format called that at one time. But these shows I work on. In fact, I worked on an hour just today. But you're right. I wouldn't go back to the splicing. I was a pretty good splicer.
Oh, yeah.
Yet,
we were flying and dying in the newsroom. I mean, 3 minutes away from a newscast, Gorbachev quits or something, and you're cutting tape trying to get it to the anchor. That's the other thing about radio. People don't realize when it's 6 o'clock, it's 6 o'clock, and you got to be in the booth.
Yeah.
When that thing goes, you know, you got to get CBS News. You can't be in the bathroom. You can't have the hiccups. You have to be there. Chuck, one final thing. If you could go back to any era during your career, it could even be now, where you said working for Autry, was that the most fun you had?
I was fortunate to have 3 pretty good bosses. A guy named Wally Clark when I worked for Gannett in Los Angeles, Rick Buckley that I worked for at KGIL, and Gene Autry and Bill Ward, who ran his broadcast properties. They were marvelous times. I would take any of the 3 jobs with those people all over again right now. And that's about a 30-year span.
You and I love music. Even though I was a newsman most of my life, I say I go around whistling all the time. I have a friend who plays piano 3 nights a week. I'm always there. Does it hurt you as much as it hurts me to know that young people today, many of them, have never heard melody? It's foreign to them.
Yes, it does. I was at the gym, and I walked up to the person running the music at the gym, and I said, "Nice to hear that Streisand record here." He gave me a very strange look.
I know. I have a friend who's a mystery shopper for fast food restaurants, and his favorite question is to go up to the manager and say, and I'm going to use the word Muzak the same way we use the word Kleenex, is the Muzak that's playing for the customers or the employees? And the answer will always be, oh, it's for the customers. And my buddy looks at him and said, really? I would have never known.
That's right.
Chuck, this has been a fun hour. Thanks for the clips. And we could probably go on for about a month. But boy, you know, the things you did to organize good music and make it available even for the smallest radio stations. I compliment you for that.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for going back into the archives with me. I'm Dennis Daly. See you next time, right here on YouTube.